All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Black History Month celebration, lecture, engagement, at least one of the engagements that we're doing. Is there anything I need to do to ensure that I am off mute with those who are joining us via Zoom? Nope, good to go, is what I'm hearing. Okay, great. Well, then we will jump right in. So we're privileged today to have with us Dr. David Daniels, who is the Henry Winters Luce Professor of World Christianity at McCormick Theological Seminary. Dr. Daniels has a Master's of Divinity from Yale and got his PhD right here in New York City at the Union Theological Seminary. He is a prolific professional and academic. I am not going to attempt to read everything that Dr. Daniels has achieved and accomplished, but there's a few highlights that I do want to hit. He's the author of a variety of articles published in several scholarly works. He's been an advisor to video documentaries and a participant in various research projects, particularly involving the study of religion in the urban context, something that, of course, we are deeply interested in here. He has lectured extensively around the world, quite literally both domestically and internationally, and has been an ordained minister in the Church of God in Christ since 1980, which is yet another hallmark of your heart for service, sir. So I was particularly interested in one of the courses that Dr. Daniels teaches. It's a 600 level course, History of Spiritual Formation, the Use and Misuse of Spirituality in American Churches. What a timely topic that has been in the last several years, unfortunately, to be honest. Now, we're privileged that Dr. Daniels is a friend of King's, as indicated by his heartfelt engagement and experience with us as we were envisioning and standing up our own Center for the Study of Christianity and the Black Experience. In addition, we're privileged this year to offer a hybrid course that Dr. Daniels will be teaching. So this, I say hybrid because the first part of the course will be here in person. The middle portion will be via Zoom, and then the latter portion of the course will again be back in person here in New York City. The course is going to be The Church in Africa Since 1500, Reformations of the 16th Century and the 21st Century. So I think that will be a fascinating course for those who are interested in participating. It will be offered through our Religious and Theological Studies Department and cross-listed as a history course. And it'll begin the week following commencement, so over the summer time frame. So we're privileged not just to hear from Dr. Daniels today, but look forward to what we'll learn from you in the future, and our students have the opportunity to study under your tutelage in the summertime frame. So with that, would you please help me welcome Dr. Daniels?
It's truly an honor to be here. I want to thank Professor David Tubbs for arranging all of this and getting me to know King's, partly through the Center for Christianity and Black Experience. And it's exciting what you're doing. I've been excited about meeting your president on the previous meeting and meeting the finance professor. I should let you know that this is not your standard course on or standard discussion on African American Christianity. I am pushing the envelope. I had a professor once that says, I'm taking you out on a limb, and the limb could break. So I'd like you to realize that. And so if you leave here and say, is everybody saying this? The answer is no. So the focus is, again, I'm part of a group that speaks of a Black Europe, in my case, speaking of the 16th century and 17th century, and then joining others who speak of a Christian Africa. Here's some things that I want to do today. And one is to locate the origins of African American Christianity in African Christian communities of Africa and Europe. So for some people, they didn't even know that there were African Christian communities in Europe. So that's just a start. Some of them even think they were in Africa either, to be honest. Second, to identify the first generations of Africans who brought Christianity to the 13 colonies, beginning in 1619. If you were able to see This Is My Story by Professor Henry Louis Gates, the documentary in February of last year, one of the things is he noted in focusing that there were Christians in Africa, and some of those Christians came, unfortunately, voluntarily through the slave trade. 3, to explore Christian communities in Africa and Europe in which these African Christians lived. So just get some sense of some of the places and how does one look at them. 3rd, spotlight early modern discourses which engage African Christians prior to the rise of modern racism. And again, some people do not think when you're speaking of leading European thinkers that you might read in the history of Western civilization class, that they actually are engaging African Christians and African Christianity. And then lastly, to reconstruct the African and Afro-European origins of Black American, Christianity, and then propose some implications. So that's the ride I like us to go on. Possibly each one of them could have been a lecture in and of themselves. So get ready and get your seatbelt on. So first I want to start with the end of the title. So there's scholars like Cornel West, George Fredrickson, Catherine Gerbner, who argue that modern racism doesn't begin until the late 1600s, maybe 1660, or maybe as late as 1700. And it's a collusion of slavery, capitalism, the Enlightenment emerging that justifies the enslavement of this population. And then the whole question about, are Africans human? Do they have mental capacities, spiritual capacities, moral capacities? Those questions really are not raised by educated people in Europe until around that time in any serious way. So if that's the case, if there's no questions about that, then what is the experience of these Africans who are Christian prior to 1660, or at least prior to 1700? What I want us to do today then is to critique a couple of things. One is that the story of African Christianity starts in North America. So if there's African Christians who are bringing it here, it's not starting here, it's starting in what I call Black Europe or starting in Christian Africa. Second, that the Africans who were first introduced to Christianity on the slave plantation form the basis of African American Christianity. That's my biggest one. I want to say no. The beginnings of African American Christianity are in, again, Black Europe and within Christian Africa. Third, that African American Christianity emerged as a response to anti-Black racism, or was created in the grips of racism. Sears Lincoln made that argument very clearly and ferociously of how the Black church serves as a response to that. But if the Black church is beginning prior to modern racism, then there's another context, environment in which it is being situated. Fourth, African American Christianity was founded as an oral tradition. Some wonderful works have been done on the stories, folklore, other things that have been part of the oral tradition that form African American Christianity. But if there's a literary tradition that precedes it, then how does one factor that in? And then lastly, that African Christians were not a topic in early modern discourse, except as a topic related to slavery. So are leading Europeans either engaging African Christians or thinking about African Christianity in any kind of way? And so one of the things is I've done some work with some others on especially Ethiopian Christians and Ethiopian Christianity and the Reformation. I promise you, if you open up 95% of books that said the Reformation in their title, they will not have an index entry on Ethiopian Christianity, and it won't even be mentioned in a footnote. So what we're doing is saying, how does one tell the story, realizing that the scholarship has not caught up? And then this approach. So in the title, the word is excavation. Those of you who are interested in archaeology know that excavation is you're digging through layers. And in different layers, you find things. And obviously in archaeology, you'll find a piece of a vessel, or you find a piece of an object, and then you try to recreate it. And then when you go down to another layer, you'll see that there's an earlier form of that society that's a little deeper because everything is building on top of each other. So I like us to use that's the image. And if I was good with art, I would show you different layers in my presentation so you could see when you're on the bottom layer and when you're on the top layer, but I'm not that good. So let's start, part one. How do we identify the first generations of Africans who brought Christianity to the 13 colonies? And I mentioned 13 colonies because it's really clumsy. Number one, when we talk about the Eastern Seaboard, we never talk about Spanish Florida. So, I'm bracketing that just because I want to do with the parts that moved towards the United States earlier on. So that's why this is the 13 colonies. I'm building on the scholarship of Ira Berlin, Linda Hayward, Graham Russell Hodges, Jerry DeWolf, Catherine Gerbner, Josiah Young. I should have also mentioned Chloe Iriton, and then there's others whose work I'm building on. I'm not clearing the space by myself. Mateo Salvador. So all of them are informing what I'm doing. I'm looking at primary material too, but I'm also dealing with their frameworks. So I'm not out on this limb alone. So I'm not going to go through every name, but I want you to know that we have two things at work. So scholars like Jern de Wolf and others argue that you can tell where these Africans are from by how they construct their name. And you can tell by how they're from. Also the fact that when they arrived, in this case, in what was New Amsterdam, which becomes New York, the Dutch Reformed Church, or the Amsterdam classes, allow them to have their children baptized because they recognized the baptism of these Africans that came over at least by 1630s. So again, you can see there's a group from the Congo following that argument. There's a group from Angola, a group from Loango, a group from São Tomé, a group from Cape Verde. And then in Europe, there's John Philip, who documents say that he was baptized in 1612, shows up within what becomes the 13 colonies in 1624. There's Fernando Negro, who also is in that category. And then there's others that's there. And then the others at the bottom are places that we can't identify. But all of these would be, as far as scholars recognize, African Christians who come already baptized, already having gone through some kind of catechism, already practicing the Christian faith, and are accepted within the Christian churches, either in New Amsterdam, which becomes New York, or accepted in Jamestown, within the Church of England, or other places, part of the 13 colonies, within the 1600s. We find that these are churchgoers, they join members. There's a Reformed church in the Bowery that 40 Africans are members of by 1640, I believe is even earlier. They have a tradition of having Christian weddings, having their children baptized. That's one of the issues that is in the forefront of the discussion in the 1600s. These Africans want their children to be baptized. And by the time you get to 1660, there's these questions about why do you want your children baptized? Do you think there's some link between baptism and manumission? It has to be some ulterior motives without recognizing there's a history because they're Christian of being baptized. There's a history of designating godparents, and these godparent designations are seen to be slightly different than the European understanding of godparents. Jern de Wolf think that there's some frameworks of brotherhoods or sodalities or lay societies. There's practice of Christian funerals and burials. And there's a tradition of petitioning for rights. There's a group in Portugal that will petition for rights of the wives of husbands who are fishermen to sell their fish in the market in Lisbon. There's a petition for their societies to be getting a charter from the crown. And then there's petitions for freedom. So there's this whole tradition of petitioning that will, if you know the history of African Americans, that this petitioning tradition will continue all the way up to the 19th century. And then I put in brackets, at least within the colonies, this first generation will begin to own property. They'll own property in what becomes Brooklyn. There's another group that owns some property in what becomes New Jersey. And there's a group in the Chesapeake Bay area, their own property in the Maryland area, and some in the Virginia area. And this is all by 1650. How can they navigate that? People like Ira Berlin says, because they're already socialized, in a sense, into a Western kind of interaction. So they're not coming from a hunter-gatherer society being plopped within the West and then asked to function. They've already navigated things. So they, as you know, your average white immigrant is not a landowner in any period of American society, but clearly not in 1650. And yet these people are. This small group is. The other thing I should have mentioned is that when you see their names, that even though some of them are in a Dutch colony or in an English colony, they'll have a Portuguese or Spanish kind of name, carrying over from their tradition because they had already had a baptismal name. And then their children will often also have the same names. I wanted you to get to hear, quote, the voice of one of these African Christians who were in the United States. His earlier record he's described as Francisco Negro, but then he anglicizes his name to Francis Payne. And this is in his will. Again, he's a property owner. As all smart property owners, you have a will so that your property doesn't go to probate. So he has a will. And in the will, just listen to his language. And I'm told by scholars that look at wills in this period, this is not the way the English write their wills. This is the way, I think, is being echoed from what they learned within their Catholic period, even though he's part of a Protestant church. He carries that language over. So I bequeath my soul to my loving Father, my Creator, and to Jesus Christ, whereby his blood and passion suffered for my sins. And all ye world would trusting through his merits to enjoy that heavenly portion prepared for me and all true believers. And as for my body, I bequeath unto the ground from whence it came, there to receive Christian burial. And there's other things that's in here, but I wanted you to sort of hear how they're thinking. And again, according to scholars of this period, he's not writing in a formulaic way that the English would write at the time, even though he's in the English colony. Now, where are these African Christians coming from that we saw on this list? Some are coming from Christian Africa, Congo, Angola, Loango, Sao Tome, Cape Verde, and some are coming from Black Europe, England, Portugal, and Holland, at least for this group. Just some numbers, and a scholar by the name of Todd Johnson at Gordon Conwell Seminary in Massachusetts is a demographer and known for numbers. And so these are the numbers that he's, quote, verified in quotation marks. Egypt, there's 70,000 Christians by 1650. Ethiopia, there's 2.7 million. That's the largest concentration of African Christians in the world at this time. Congo, 150,000. In other countries, it's like 20,000. That's between Ndongo, Loango, those other places. To make a total of 3.4 million Christians in Christian Africa. And then in Black Europe, the numbers are a lot smaller. Spain and Portugal estimated 50,000 out of 100 to 200,000 Africans that are on the Iberian Peninsula. In England, there's maybe 150 by 1650. In Rome, there's maybe 10. They're basically men who are there as monks who either at a study center or a small college. In Holland, it's unclear what the numbers are. And then there was by 1515, actual community in Cyprus that is key within this period. So to make 50,160. So here's a picture of what Lisbon looked like between 1570 and 1578. It's a painting that's describing one of the streets that's there, Rua Nova dos Mercadores. It's a financial and it's commercial boulevard. But you can even see, even though we're looking in light, that this is what we now would call an interracial scene. And again, this is sometime between 1570 and 1578. Here's a closer picture. Now, again, this gentleman on the, and this is supposedly a description. This is almost like an early pre-photograph. So it's not someone's imagination. This is what they're painting, what they're seeing. So there's obviously a man of some means who has a horse, and he has, looks like he might be in some order of Christian knights, the outfit that he has on. And then in the scene to the further over, you just see again that I don't know whether it's 10, 20% of this street is people of African descent. Demographers say that about 10% of the Lisbon population is of African descent. There's 100,000 people in Lisbon at this time. That means there are 10,000 Africans or people of African descent living in Lisbon. Now, just can we pause? When you took the course on Renaissance, at another school, did you in that course understand that 10% of Lisbon was Black? And that there's even portrayals of that you can then see the images that are there. So this is my best visual place because this is the largest concentration of African Christians in Europe. And you can see that they're visible in many different ways. I should say that some people from Holland and other parts of Europe were shocked when they went to Lisbon because they said, can this be Europe? And then those of you who know Iberian history, there's the story about, quote, Black Spain. And what that story says is that once you get to the Pyrenees, the mountains that divide France and Spain, that when you cross over from France and cross over the Pyrenees into Spain, you're no longer in Europe. You're in the northernmost part of Africa. And cities like this was proof for them that you're not in Europe anymore. So as I mentioned, 10,000 Africans out of a population of 100,000 in Lisbon. This is a full-blown African Christian community. There are families, baptism and godparents and weddings and funerals. There are lay societies, lay organizations like Knights of Columbus, but these are Our Lady of the Rosary for the enslaved, Our Lady of the Rosary for Black brothers, Brotherhood of Benedict the Moor or Palermo, and they start as early as the 1400s. These confraternities or brotherhoods. There are even some people of African descent who are priests, often biracial, we would now call them. Some are teachers. One of the cathedral schools in Lisbon, the head of that school is a person of African descent. Craftspeople, as I mentioned, fishermen, others, and common workers, all of them are populated within the society. But also, as early as 1484, you began to see Africans being educated within Portuguese and Latin within Portugal. By the 1500s, they're actually attending monastery schools and the universities. So the list is there. St. Aloy Monastery, matter of fact, St. Aloy Monastery by 1600 had students who were African, students who were from South India, students who were white, now we call them white Portuguese, who are all preparing for missionary work. University of Coimbra, St. Jerome, St. Augustine College, Jesuit College, all of these are schools, universities, colleges in Portugal in the 1500s that have African students and that will graduate, and some of them will become professors. So at one of the schools in Granada, the occupant of the chair was a person of African descent. The chair was in Latin. England is a totally different story. Not only is there not 100 to 200,000 people as there is on the Iberian Peninsula, and there is not 10,000 people in London as there are 10,000 people in Lisbon. The community there's about 1,000 people in all of England of African descent, and maybe 10% of them are Christian. And so therefore, it's a smaller Christian community. They're Protestants. And many of them live in the West End of London. So for those of you who like Shakespeare, Shakespeare on a normal day would run into an African on the street as you would run into a person of African descent here in New York, but in the West End of London. They show up in the parish records as being baptized. They show up in the records as being married, and they show up in parish records for their funerals. So they are there with records sustaining the fact of their presence. But notice, they're not admitted to the universities and colleges. There's no sense that they have the same kind of social organizations like a brotherhood. Those things aren't there. They're what I call a thin community, as opposed to the complex community that's in Lisbon, and well as Portugal and Spain. But there are other other Black Europeans, as they're sometimes called. There's Ethiopians who live in Jerusalem and Cyprus, as well as those who come to the European mainland as emissaries, ecumenical delegates, and pilgrims. There's the Ethiopian Study Center. If you've ever been to the Vatican or seen pictures of the Vatican, in St. Peter's Basilica, literally right to the, if this is St. Peter's Basilica, right on this side, the chapel there was dedicated for the Ethiopians to use to have their liturgy and gaze. And that's as early as 1510, if not before then. They create a hostel there for Ethiopian pilgrims. I mean, if they're traveling to Rome, I mean, they should have somewhere to stay. At one point, it looks like it becomes a college, both for training. And then there's ambassadors not only from Ethiopia, but from Congo, from Warri, from Benin, from Alada, which is part of Nigeria, to Europe. And these ambassadors go to Rome, Lisbon, Amsterdam, Madrid, and maybe some other places. And they're received as ambassadors in different kinds of relationships. Chloe Ireton has done a study to say that in the debate of whether African Christians should be put in the same category as Muslim and Jewish converts, meaning new Christians, or should African Christians be put in the category of old Christians, like the Italians, the French, the Spanish. And in the study that she focused on, dealing with Seville at least, they were classified as old Christians, because of the fact that there's a history of Ethiopians being Christian, we now know, going back to the 4th century. But at that time, there was some that thought it went back to the 1st century, being illustrated by the 8th chapter of Acts. And so this image of them then, again, modern racism, are they human? Do they have moral capacity? Do they have spiritual capacities? Can they actually be Christian? It's not an issue, because we already have a history of Ethiopians being Christian longer than Russians, Swedes, Germans, and therefore, in their understanding of that, it's not even an issue. That's a modern racism issue. It's a modern racism question, but it is not their question. How do we know? That's why they can show up at the colleges and universities. That's why they can become, a few of them can become professors and teachers. That's why they become priests, because of the fact that that's not even a question. Christian Africa, Congo, Angola, Luango. I should have an A in there. Luango, São Tomé, Cape Verde. Just in case you can't recall your African map. So the Congo is right here. You can see the one in the circle. And then if you go literally diagonally across, you'll see where Ethiopia is in that purplish color. And then if you see where the straight ahead from the circle, you see Benin, and then you'll see the area that's now modern Nigeria. And that's where Benin and Warri and Alada are. And then, of course, the Senegambia area where it says Wolof, there's also some communities there. And right off of there, the island right under the W, that's Cape Verde. So there's this acknowledging of African Christians or Christianity. So there's documents that are written, statements that are made, that are published by the list that I have here. And again, I won't go with all the names. But I'm looking at the right-hand side, at least my right-hand side, my left-hand side, your right-hand side. People like Erasmus, a person by the name of Johannes Potkins, people like Martin Luther, Philip Melanchthon, Martin Bucer, Theodore Beza, Anna von Scherman, Miguel Cervantes, Don Quixote's author of Don Quixote, they all are mentioning and engaging African Christians and African Christianity in some kind of way in the 1500s and 1600s. Cervantes, he refers to Juan Latino, but he doesn't mention Juan Latino by name. In Christian Africa, there are Catholic parishes in the Congo and Luango and Ndongo, Angola, and Toma. There's Christian communities, as I mentioned. There's these lay societies that here. And then there's places outside of those who are part of or forced into the slave trade. In the Empire of the Congo, which is one of the most amazing stories of Christian history, period, but also one of the most amazing stories of Christian history dealing with Africa outside of Ethiopia and Egypt. The Congo embraces Catholicism around 1490. Catholic monarchy is created. The Congolese form and prepare, educate a group of priests. The second Congolese Catholic monarch, King Afonso, not only wants Congolese who are priests, but he wants Congolese who are bishops. And so he appeals for his son, Enrique or Henry, to be consecrated as a bishop. He's not of age yet. He's like in his 20s, early 20s. I think you have to be a little further in your 20s by canonical law. But the Pope makes an exception in the favor of having him being consecrated. There's a Catholic school system of over 1,000 students by 1516. Boys and girls are being educated. As you might know, some of you can probably help me. Europe is probably 80% illiterate at that time. By 1516. There's a book reading culture that's there. Books are being imported from Portugal in order for them to be used throughout the empire. The cathedral actually has an organ that was sent in the 1490s, and then another organ is going to be sent to another place later in the 1500s. And people are sent there to teach the Congolese how to play the organ. A Catholic college opens around 1620. They had hoped to open one up in 1550s, but were unsuccessful. Again, there's brotherhoods. And then there's this, Cecile Froment has done a wonderful study on the book is entitled The Art of Conversion, talking about Congolese Christian art, crucifixes and other kinds of items. Cape Verde also is a very complex African Christian community. There are Black priests, canons, catechists, singers. The Episcopal staff is all African. There's a seminary, parishioners, and there's an ethnic group coming from that part of West Africa called the Sape, who convert to Christianity in the early 1500s. And they also create African Christian art. I think there's some pieces at the Metropolitan Museum of Art here in New York. So this Black Europe and Christian Africa by 1619 had African clergy, African Christian practices, African Christian art, an educated elite set of African Christians, as well as these lay societies that I was describing. Let's go to discourse. So to my surprise, when one looks at early political science, biology, literature, philosophy, and theological studies, African Christians or African Christianity is noted, most often Ethiopian. So these are European who engage Ethiopian Christianity. Erasmus, I already mentioned the first set of names. Francisco Alvarez produces a book about Ethiopian Christianity that's widely distributed. Gois does the same. It gets translated by John Moore, Thomas More's son, into English, and it's widely distributed. Jean Baudin is an early thinker related to political science, and then Scaliger, Ludolf, and Cervantes that I mentioned a few minutes ago. The engagement goes from actual meetings. Michael the deacon or Abba Michael actually travels to Germany, to Wittenberg in 1534, and has a long set of conversations with Luther and with Philip Melanchthon, the leaders and founders, in a sense, of the Reform movement in Germany. Luther, of course, is the name in which Lutherans get their name from. In the discussion, Luther is curious about how the practices of Ethiopian Christianity can exist outside of the Pope. Can you actually have a church that exists that's not under the subjection of the Pope? And Ethiopian Christianity was. And then he wanted to know, well, what are the features of it? And he found out they had a married clergy, they had communion of both kinds, they did not believe in purgatory, and their Bible, as he understood it, was in the vernacular. Those of you who know just a little bit, even a Wikipedia version of Martin Luther was interested in married clergy. He was interested in the Bible in German, in the vernacular. He was interested in dropping purgatory as a concept, and he wanted communion in bread and wine and not just one of the elements. Tassilo Seon is in Rome. Cervini, who becomes a leader within the Catholic Church, is engaging him, serves as a patron. Saga Zaab, who sometimes described as Zago Zaba, gets quoted, but I was trying to do a count, I think by at least 30 people, including Cotton Mather, the leading Puritan within the United States in the late 1600s, early 1700s. Vicente Lusitano was a major music theorist. He's an Afro-Portuguese Roman Catholic priest. He was a major music theorist, engaged in a major debate within Rome in the mid 16th century, who then converts to Protestantism. He becomes what I describe as the first Afro-Portuguese Roman Catholic priest to become Protestant. And then Juan Latino was one of the most famous poets in Spain during his lifetime. And he writes some poetry where he includes Ethiopians in the story in a positive light. So one of the things that one can see is that people like Martin Luther, Pierre Dumoulin, and Joel Ludon, is that it looks like they're arguing Luther in the 16th century, Ludolf in the 17th century, that Ethiopian Christianity might have been a forerunner of Protestantism. At the Council of Trent, the famous council that brings the Catholic Church into looking for an educated clergy, requiring if you're going to be a clergy, you need to know how to read. Ethiopians are already doing that in 1516. Trent makes a requirement in the 1540s through the 1550s during the council. But then there's a question, and again, it's a Spanish theologian that raises the question. Who are the theologians who are probably most interacting with people who are African Christians? The Spanish and the Portuguese. So a question occurs that if we prohibit the vernacular, he suggests that we don't condemn it. Why? Because there's Slavonic traditions that are part of the Catholic Church that have a vernacular. The vernacular Bible is among the Ethiopians as well as the Greek and Russians. He puts them in the same company. And if I read it correctly, Vatican approves. But then in 1561, Pope Pius IV invites one of the leaders of the Ethiopian community in Ethiopia to come to the Council of Trent in order to be an interlocutor. There's a group, small but influential, of Ethiopian teachers who teach gaze to Europeans. So Samuel teaches Potkin, and then Potkin creates a grammar and other kinds of texts. The Psalms are published in gaze. Samuel verifies that the script is correct. Tassilo Seon teaches Vittori, who then also, they create a grammar text and also translate parts of the New Testament into gaze. You should know that the first books that were published of any topic that was not within a European language and not in Hebrew was in gaze, Ethiopian language. Before Chinese, Japanese, before any other language, they were the first. Before Arabic even, gaze was the first. I'm not going to go through all the names, but between the Potkin that we mentioned around 1510s to the 1600s, this is just a list that I found of people who knew how to read gaze and who were taught. So I asked, in theological studies, I'm not sure how many of my colleagues, including myself, know one African language. I'm not sure the circles that I'm in, whether knowing an African language is a sign of being educated. But for these people, the list that's here, They saw it as a necessity because they wanted to understand how the Ethiopian tradition related to Christianity, how it could teach them more about the Christian faith. Let's go to political science. So Jean Baudin, an early political theorist of the late 1500s, included Ethiopia in the nations and governments of the world. I'm not sure if any of you ran across the insight from Friedrich Hegel from the 19th century. Africa has no history. This is the 19th century. 3 centuries earlier, Jean Baudin thinks Africa does have a history, thinks Ethiopia is key to that history. In his 6 books of the Commonweal, he classifies the sovereign Ethiopia along with France, England, Scotland, and Spain. He says that India, quote, and then translated in English, and almost all of the kingdoms, should be plural, of Africa and Asia. And then, according to Baudin, Ethiopia, translated from the French, is the oldest monarchy in all of Asia and Africa. Hegel said Africa has no history. No government's worth even studying. But in this period, again, before the rise of modern racism, not only does he think it is, he publishes it. And he bases it on a text dealing with Alvarez, as I mentioned earlier, that discussed Ethiopia. There's also statecraft and diplomacy. The Queen Elena reaches out to some European capitals in order to be in relationship. The Saxon Gotha Duke Ernest the Pious wants to be in a diplomatic relationship with Ethiopia. Ludolf serves as a representative for the German, the French, the English, and the Dutch to create some alliance with Ethiopia in the late 1600s. The French king, Louis the 14th, also wants a relationship with Ethiopia. The Polish king, Jan Sobieski, also wants a relationship. And then the Ethiopian emperor in the early 1700s also wants a relationship. So this idea of no history, no literature, no writing, no knowledge doesn't fit this period. And lastly, I think this is on the discourse. The Royal Society, which was formerly the Royal Society of London for Improving Natural Knowledge, it was the first scientific academy. And even though it was lodged in London, there were people from Holland and other places that were part of the academy. One of the things they had as their consensus was that there was only one Genesis, there was only one beginning, that humanity comes out of one people, that there's not different origins of people. And then they wanted to know, why is there a difference between blacks and whites? And also the shades in between. And they argued that the differences had no link to mental, moral, or spiritual capacities. And then they said the difference has to do with sun tanning, maybe, or maybe something that happens on the skin, but the differences are only skin level. Doesn't touch the mind, the soul. And this is one of the major scientific societies of the world in the late 1600s. Now, obviously, they lose because modern racism takes over, and then you get this whole discussion about subhumanity and everything that follows. But it follows. It's not created for them. So let's reconstruct the story. So then we tell the story, that the story of African American Christianity begins in Black African Europe. That's what I would want to argue for. That African American Christianity emerged out of a complex Black Christian societies like those in the Congo, Cape Verde, and Portugal, as well as thin Christian communities like those in England. That African American Christianity emerged out of a context where elite African Christians engaged leading Europeans like Erasmus and Luther and others, and participated within a book reading culture. That African Christians were a topic in early modern discourses such as theology, philosophy, literature, music, and biology. Literature and music I didn't mention. And among the first generation of African American Christians during the 1600s were churchgoers, landowners, and in one case, Mateus de Sousa, a colonial Maryland legislator in around 1641. Let me stop. Here's a picture, art piece of an African woman. Here's an African, a Congolese knight, leader. I think he's also an ambassador. And then the Other picture is one of the Ethiopian emperors. Questions and answers.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm wondering how you might respond to some resistance to this presentation, especially by evangelicals, who are probably going to argue that West Africa in particular, as opposed to East Africa, in terms of the Protestant tradition, that the introduction of Christianity from Protestants with Africans coming out of West Africa was speaking into a void where they were worshiping rocks and animism and things like that. How would you respond? I'd say particularly for evangelicals who are going to struggle with this, because they've been taught that there was no Christianity in West Africa. They're not going to object to the Orthodox Christianity and the Catholic tradition, but the West African in particular, people are going to struggle a lot with that. Does that make sense, the question?
No, it does. So the first thing is, the Protestant history would be one that I would start here with someone like John Philip, who's baptized by 1612. And he comes to North America. So when he comes, if he's talking to Africans who are from West Africa who didn't know anything about Christianity, they might be looking to him, either just to explain who are these people, even if he's not trying to evangelize, but it's just a simple question. Second, the population in London is small, but 100 is a number. And so therefore, seemingly if one is, I'm a historian, chronologically, I need to start with the chronology. Third, so the big question is, if this is correct, that these people knew Christianity already, some of them have been in families that were Catholic, let's say, for 100 years or more. And then they are forced, because the Catholic Church doesn't exist within the Dutch colony, to then become Protestant, which they willingly do. And if they are the ones who are working alongside of the Africans from West Africa, who are not from Cape Verde, not from Kachu, not from the few other places where there is a Protestant presence, they are the interpreters. Why? Number one, they can probably speak the language, or somebody in the community that can speak the language, because these people are not totally conversant in Dutch or English, in year one. Number two, they might not agree with them, but they're the ones that maybe are serving as the catalyst. There's a book that's called The Africanization of Christianity, which focuses on low country South Carolina, the Goose Creek, Sea Island area. The author's name of Alfred Butler. It's a book based on his dissertation. But he notes there that the first mass conversion of Africans to Protestantism in North America occurs in that area. That area, according to Josiah Young and some other scholars, has a disproportionate high number of Congolese and Angolans. There's a priest by the name, Anglican priest, by the name of Francis Joujot, who in his diary as early as 1710 says that on this plantation in Goose Creek, South Carolina, are Africans who are Christians from Angola who are asking for communion. And he says, my thing is that I will only give you communion if you denounce the Pope and everything connected with Catholicism. So now granted, initially one has to think, are those isolated cases? Or is that really an example of something that might have been happening in other places? Reading against the grain, taking that as seriously, I want to make it central. So the other part of the question, which you didn't ask, but others said, so did Africans from West Africa need slavery to be introduced to Christianity? And in this case, the answer would have been no. They could have learned from Cape Verde, they could have learned from Kachu, they could have learned if they traded at all with anybody from Warri, Benin, or Olada, which is part of Nigeria. All of that, even outside of the so-called slave forts in Gori or Elmina, even outside of those, things were already happening. Thank you, Professor Brown.
Can I ask one follow-up question? So where in your studies does the curse of Ham emerge in the ways in which that passage is particularly applied to Africans? Do you have any sense of when that exegesis begins to pop up?
So if you look at someone like Martin Luther, who again is meeting, having dinner, lunch, housing, Abba Michael or Michael the deacon, he's not making that argument. That argument, I think there are some people who are making the argument, but it's not the dominant way of reading the text until you get to after 1700. So it looks like then a rationalization. So, again, I mean, what I have a hard time understanding, when Phyllis Wheatley's poetry is published sometime in the mid 1700s, people like Thomas Jefferson, can an African actually do this? Juan Latino was already a famous poet 200 years before, already proved, and there was other Black poets that was there. So the whole question about can someone have that capacity, it showed that they were not aware of European history. And if they had, they would have known this. Now, there is something, as you notice, I put a lot of the weight of the conversation is on Spain and Portugal. And you know, Anglophiles are only interested in English history. So we then deny something actually existed because we don't want to learn from the Spaniards and Portuguese. Maybe because they're Catholic, maybe because they used to be dominated under Muslim conquest. There might be a lot of reasons, but we then miss the knowledge. And then again, I still am struck by a street that looks like this, that is actually in Europe in the 1570s. None of that shows up in History of Western Civilization. And none of that one picks up from starting at London as the starting point. But I hope, as we're all educated, we don't compartmentalize our knowledge by where it's from. And notice, I'm not necessarily trying to take a footnote and then create something. Trying to say the documents are arguable.
So Dr. Carl asks, do you have any thoughts about the current civil war that has engulfed Ethiopia? Is Christianity a resource for peace, or is it fueling the war?
My understanding is that it's ethnic differences that's there and power issues that's there, and that it's not like the Orthodox are fighting the Protestants. On the resource part, the answer is probably yes. But again, as we saw in Northern Ireland, as we saw within former Yugoslavia, ethnic strife, even people of the same faith, can be deadly, unfortunately.
Dr. Daniels, thank you for coming and speaking to us today. I was wondering if you could give a little bit more characterization as to why you think that this narrative has been lost. It was interesting, you just talked about sort of the Thomas Jefferson approach. And do you think that it was more of a, in the present sense, a justification for slavery, that we didn't talk about the Christian origins of the African Christian origins, or was it more of a retroactive, sort of trying to make people feel better about the fact that slavery happened and not that, like after the fact of slavery? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. And I think it might be multiple things, but let me start off with one. So any of your professors here, unless they're teaching Spanish or Portuguese, they probably did not need to learn Spanish or Portuguese to get their PhD. They need to learn French or German. Sometimes people will let you do Spanish. I'm not sure who asks you or requires you to do Portuguese. So there's a bias that's there. And the archival work that's there then is totally lost. Second, modern racism does occur. And when it does arise, then it needs to justify not only enslavement of people of African descent, but the marginalization of people of African descent. And I do think that there is an element where that history gets lost. Some of you might know the Dred Scott case. And in the Dred Scott case, the decision was that there is no law on the books that applies to Africans because Africans are not citizens. However, if you look at the dissenting voice, Curtis White or something,
Justice Curtis and Justice McClain.
they argue that Africans or people of African descent were part of some of the colonial bodies that actually voted for the Constitution. Abraham Lincoln also picks that up. But that gets lost in the story because Africans not only didn't fight for the American Revolution, they didn't vote for the Constitution. But the justices say that, and Lincoln also picks it up. All of that gets muted in the conversation because it fits the scenario that this country, are just adding people of African descent as opposed to, as the 1619 projects have been arguing, Africans have actually participated in the building.
But Brent, if I could follow up on that, you know it pretty well because you took con law. So what's called the pro-slavery gloss in reading the Constitution in the 19th century. So when Dred Scott is decided, Lincoln says that the view of people of African descent in the United States now is less favorable than it was in the founding era. That is, the pro-slavery gloss, all these prejudices being read into the Constitution, right? That's why Dred Scott says, in the founding generation, there was a consensus that blacks had no rights, which whites were obliged to respect. And Curtis and McClain in dissent refute that. I mean, it's a demonstrably false assertion. They refute it, and Lincoln says, and his statement in response to Dred Scott, you really can't improve on the dissent by Curtis and McClain. He's just underscoring the fact that you have this pro-slavery gloss in the way the Constitution is read. So there's a really strong parallel here, I think.
I'm going to end on this is 115. So if you're taking an enlightenment, of course, related to enlightenment, I think you need to do some reading in the century before. Otherwise, you might reproduce racism.